Hi, welcome to Talking Books and Stuff, the program that talks all about books and writing and stuff. Here's your host, Dennis Rimmer.
And welcome back. It's yet another edition of Talking Books and Writing and stuff like that. Today with us we have Charlotte Gray speaking from Ottawa. The book in question is Passionate Mothers, Powerful Sons, The Lives of Jenny Jerome Churchill and Sarah Delano Roosevelt. And I think people would know about the sons, but Ms. Gray, it seems like your passion would be on talking about the mothers rather than the famous sons. Is that more or less a true description of your attack to this subject?
Absolutely. I mean, Dennis, what intrigued me about these two formidable women was that in the biographies of their sons, the authors often seem to denigrate the mother's influence. And the mothers are seen exclusively through the lens of sort of their maternal behavior. And in each case, they've been shoehorned into quite negative stereotypes. Jenny Jerome Churchill, Winston's mother, is regarded as a sort of flibbertigibbet who was wildly extravagant and had affairs. And Sarah Delano Roosevelt, Franklin's mother, was regarded as this very intrusive, smothering mother. And I thought, well, that happens to be how the male biographers have chosen to portray them. But what was it actually like to be those women at the time? And what else did they do besides being mothers? And so I went back to the primary sources and how contemporaries saw them and what they thought about their own lives, and discovered, in fact, much more multi-dimensional, interesting women than most people have seen.
And the book is Passionate Mothers, Powerful Sons. Now, both these mothers, if I can say that, they were both born in 1854. Not that long ago when you think about it, just almost like Canada, not that old as things go. They're very rich. Now, how rich are we talking about for their background?
Well, they both were born into families that lived only, in fact, about 100 kilometers from each other in New York. And they both were in what we now call the 1% class. They both had they were families that had made a lot of money. The Delanos particularly were super rich. They never had to worry about money. They were careful with money, but they were never short of money. The Jeromes were new money, and that made a big difference to their lives, because although they were super rich, they were regarded as rather vulgar and not really accepted by the upper class of Manhattan, who were terrific snobs. And their fortune came and went and came and went. Jenny's father was known at one point as the King of Wall Street because he'd done so well in investments during the Gilded Age. But there was a fair bit of insider trading going on, and he made fortunes, he lost fortunes. So their money was much less steady than the Delano fortune. But they were in what we call today the billionaire class.
No kidding, from what I've read. And I must compliment, if I can say that, because it sounds so condescending, but I opened the book and I said, okay, here we go. Well, I'll give this one a try. Let's see, it's going to be a dull, plodding story. And I was immediately swept up, and I can't put it down. I've just started, but the writing is so elegantly simple, if I can use that term, and it just flows, and the chapters flow, and I can see these people, and I can experience their life and times just by reading the page without even any pictures to help me. So thank you very much for what a wonderful treat this book is.
Well, that's wonderful to hear, Dennis. I'm glad you enjoyed it so much. I mean, I have to say this is my 12th book, and I've worked really hard over my career to make history just gripping, and to help people understand the reality of the past and to immerse themselves in different times, different manners, and understand characters from our past who we so easily dismiss because we think, well, they're not really like us and their society's not like our society. Of course, for these women, life was very different from the life of a woman today. Women today have far more opportunities. But there are still so many similarities between the lives of women in different periods, the kind of the sort of socialization of women, the choices that women face, how they choose their life partners, what their maternal behavior is like. For these two women in particular, you know, the grief of early widowhood, and then the upside of widowhood, when they actually had much more opportunity to do what they themselves wanted to do. And the other thing, too, about this period, I think, in fact, there's a lot of public interest in it, thanks to programs like Downton Abbey and Upstairs, Downstairs, and other historical dramas. You know, we're curious about what was it like to be a wealthy woman in the early 20th century.
And what you mentioned also is that the, let's see, the Jeromes, the father made it, let's call him a drug dealer, basically. He was a drug dealer, shipping opium into China.
That was the Delanos, yes.
Oh, Delanos,
that's quite something, you know, this very established family. But, you know, all these fortunes of the Gilded Age in New York, many of them were built on commercial empires that by our standards don't bear any examination. Many of them were rich because many of the families were rich because they owned huge plantations that were worked by slaves. In the Delano case, he was a very wealthy man because he'd been in the maritime, the China trade, and that was the trade in silk and tea and, yes, opium, which was the fentanyl of its day.
That's right. Yeah, that's what you said. I just got to that part. Like, I haven't barely scratched the surface of the book, but like I said, I'm already enthralled. I guess you also mentioned that these women, Jenny and Sarah, grew up surrounded by luxury, almost next door to abject poverty, with where their mansions were compared to what ordinary people, or even less than that, were living.
It's true, and that really hasn't changed, has it? I mean, no. Wealthy people live these very insulated lives and don't often see, for example, the street people living today in our cities, and don't pay much attention in many cases to the fact that large numbers of children are growing up in poverty. They don't feel they can do anything about it, and that also there's always that sense of it's somebody else's problem. And that's not true of everybody. I don't want to be a sort of generalized, to have a generalized sense of class difference. But I thought what was interesting was that both these women, for example, they were very conventional. They accepted the status quo. When they were young women, they certainly weren't agitating for the vote, as many of their contemporaries were. And what finally got them to support votes for women was their sons. Their sons, both Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt, as politicians looking for votes, realized in the early 20th century that the time had come to give women the vote. And rather reluctantly, their mothers, who always supported them absolutely 100%, agreed with them that women should have the vote. But it wasn't until their sons endorsed the campaigns for suffrage that they themselves embraced it, because they themselves, as very wealthy women, had quite a lot of agency in their lives.
And when you say agency, you mean like what? That they had choices. Oh, okay.
They had choices. They could make choices of where they lived and what they did and who they met. But they were much more than just sort of wealthy background characters. Jenny, in particular, took a lot of initiatives on her own that were very original. She outfitted a hospital ship for the wounded British soldiers of the South African wars in the late 19th, early 20th century. She started a literary magazine. She was a fantastic fundraiser for a national theatre in London. These were initiatives which were not really expected from a woman of her social status and class, but she wanted to grasp public opportunities. Sarah was much more retiring. She didn't have Jenny's sort of extrovert gregariousness, but Sarah herself stood for very sort of, the social values of the upper class, which included a huge benevolence to her employees and a sense of noblesse oblige. She did not think that that she could remain oblivious to, for example, what was happening to Black Americans and the horrible practice of lynching. She urged her son to do something about it. They were both in their ways public women without actually ever getting the recognition for it.
Well, they're getting recognition now, that's for sure, with this book. Why did you select these two women in particular? I'm sure there's others that you could have selected as well.
What I loved about these two was, first of all, they were, as I mentioned earlier, the coincidence of their births. The fact that the two most prominent leaders of the 20th century in the English-speaking world, Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt, their mothers were born in the same year, in the same place. That's extraordinary in itself. And then when I actually began reading about their mothers, realizing what a delicious contrast they were to each other. They're very different characters. And therefore, what fun it would be to write a book that intertwined their biographies, showing sort of the different ways that women could behave, and yet the similar result of producing two extraordinary sons.
Now, how do you actually research a topic like this? I don't know. It's not like writing a 3-page essay for high school. Like, how do you do this?
Well, this was particularly challenging because, of course, I was writing it during the COVID lockdown. Normally, I would have done some preliminary research in secondary sources, by which I mean books that have already been published about both the women and their sons, and got a sense of what their lives were like. And then I would have gone into the Roosevelt archives in Hyde Park in the Hudson Valley, just north of New York City, and then into the Churchill archives in Churchill College, Cambridge, and at Blenheim Palace, and other places where there are Churchill archives stored. And I would have spent weeks reading the original primary sources. But then COVID struck, and I couldn't leave my house, let alone travel across international borders.
I know.
So yes. I had to do a lot from secondary sources. But it was such a joy when I finally did get into the archives for both families and confirmed that when I looked at the original correspondence and the diaries and the photos, and felt actually I had made drawn the right conclusions from the material that was available.
How long did it actually take to put the book together?
Oh, about 5 years.
5 years. Whoa. That's and did you ever think sometimes that there's never going to be an end to this? Why am I doing this? What the heck? Why don't I just give up and go to watch cartoons on TV or something?
With every book, I get to that stage, and my husband says, "You always get to this stage. You know you're going to finish it. Just keep going."
And what do you pass on? What would you pass on from your experiences to other writers who get the same feeling? Same advice, just keep going?
Well, the advice to every writer, fiction, non-fiction, whatever kind it is, keep your bum on the seat and get the words on the screen.
Right, or on I was going to say typewriter, but nobody uses typewriters anymore, except I have two of them.
I'm afraid that's true.
Yep, they put the words on paper on the screen. You're right about the influence of these mothers with their sons. is still felt today in that Churchill is prominent in people's mind. There was a Oscar-winning movie a few years back with Gary Goldman playing Churchill, His Finest Hour. We still talk about that. We still talk about my uncle and aunt. Well, my uncles, two of them were in the Second World War. So was my father, but he wasn't shipped overseas. But my uncles were, and both wounded at Sicily, and they were very mournful when Winston Churchill passed away. And in the U.S., Roosevelt, he started with Social Security, I think, basically, rural free delivery for post offices, the electrification of Tennessee Valley Authority, all the projects from the 30s with the Civilian Conservation Corps, I think it was called, things like that. So we're still feeling that today. I lived in the U.S. for a while, so I get Social Security. So thank you, Mr. Roosevelt.
Yes, you're right.
And what do you hope this book will do?
I hope that it'll introduce these two formidable women to people who may not otherwise have ever heard anything about them. It'll make readers will enjoy plunging into different lives in a different period, but also that it'll suggest to readers that actually great leaders are more than just fully formed individuals who sort of spring into action when the country demands it. That in fact they come from backgrounds that have shaped their personalities and their relationships. There was a reason that Winston Churchill was such a intense, demanding young man, because he'd been like that when he tried to catch his mother's attention. There was a reason why Franklin Roosevelt was so good at keeping people at arm's length, making them feel they'd had a great meeting when he hadn't actually given anything away. He'd done the same thing with his mother when he was a boy. So that's what I hope people realize, that the children's behavior, in fact, predicts their adult behavior.
Well, I guess that doesn't bode well for me because I haven't yet grown up, but that's beside the point. The women, they must have been... any person in those days had to be tough, very mentally tough, I guess. There was no mod cons, as they say. You had to use a chamber pot. You had to chop wood. You had to, maybe they didn't, but ride a horse and, learn how to handle a four-in-hand or whatever, or hope to. The physical demands of life in those days far outstrips what we have today, I'm sure.
Well, as you say, for these women, life was pretty comfortable. They did have servants, and they had big households, but they also had servants. I mean, the big challenge for Sarah Roosevelt was always running a large estate by herself, and she was a very determined manager, and also staying in touch with her son and daughter-in-law, Eleanor. The big challenge for Jenny Churchill was that she always had a mountain of debt. She was wildly extravagant, so she was always just keeping ahead of the moneylenders. But she also had to find ways of earning her living, which she did to some extent. So, their lives were less complicated than those of pioneer women, who I've also written about in my earlier book, Sisters in the Wilderness. These two certainly didn't have to get up early and light the stove and feed the chickens, but these two women, they had their own challenges. They had their own demands, which they met with flying colors.
And they seem to have done that quite well, as we know by their success with their sons. You have 3 sons. You hope you're as well a good an influence on them as these people were with their sons?
Well, the other thing I hope that people take away from the book is that there's no cookie-cutter way of raising children. That, you can either be a very distant mother or you can be an almost too intrusive mother. And still, there's nurture, which plays a hugely important role, but there's also nature. Right. So as long as you love your children and demonstrate that to to them. You just find your own way in terms of how to raise them.
And the article that got me going on this path to get this book and carry on with an interview is the story Saturday, September 9th in the Saskatoon Star-Phoenix, The Cautious Historian. That's what Jamie Portman called you. How do you react to that title?
Well, I thought it was a lovely article. And I don't mind being called a cautious historian because, the great compliment to my writing is always, it's history, but it reads like a novel, i.e. it's easy to read. But I always want people to realize that I don't write fiction, I don't write novels, that I do have really good research backing up every single sentence in my book. I'm cautious about drawing conclusions unless I have evidence. So I took it as a compliment.
I do too. And were there any surprises going in or coming out of the project that you didn't think would ever show up?
Actually, there were so many because I knew so little. Everything was a surprise. I mean, I was absolutely amazed at the debts that Jenny Churchill accumulated and also how she quietly cheated her sons out of their inheritance until they realized what was going on. She was so short of money that she never gave them their fair share. And with Sarah, I think what I was really amazed by was how important she was to Franklin and Eleanor in terms of helping them raise their children. But I think more than that, I was just fascinated by their lives and what strong-willed individuals they were.
They sound that way even from in their early ages when they wanted to do things their way, and that was it. In subtle ways sometimes, or in outright demands in other ways. The book is Passionate Mothers, Powerful Sons, The Lives of Jenny Jerome Churchill and Sarah Delano Roosevelt, written by Charlotte Gray. Do you have any other projects in mind now that this one's out of the way, so to speak?
I'm just beginning to conceive. I'm just beginning to think about what I might do next. But I definitely think there'll be another book.
So, yeah, when you finish one book, you say to yourself, that's it, no more, never again?
Oh, no.
Oh, good.
I'd also like to get rid of this COVID cough.
Oh, yes.
Which has dogged me for months.
Well, I know what you mean. It seems like in our household, we just never seem to get away from being tired all the time. And I don't know what that's all about. But I want to thank you very much for your time today. We'll let you go away and take care of that cough and hope to maybe chat with you when the next book comes out.
I'd love that, Dennis. Thank you.
Thank you for visiting with us today. This is Talking Books and Stuff with Dennis Rimmer. Contact him at dennis@talkingbooks.tk. Thank you, and may all the good news be yours. Oh, and don't forget to check out his book, The Great Canadian Notebook, available across Canada and at amazon.ca.